Thank you, Doctor, for having the opportunity to interview you. We have two choices. We can do this interview in Romanian because my English is not so good. But if my English is better than your Romania, we can still stay in English. I started learning English around 1 year ago, and I'm still not a very good English speaker.
Well, your English mastery seems quite adequate to me, and I will venture to guess that your English is better than my Romanian. So we'll proceed in English if you don't mind.
Okay, that's awesome. I want to ask you to make an introduction about you. I want to know more of how you start the science of longevity, how you start into sport, if all of your life you was into sport, if you start later, some of your hobbies, what job do you have?
Sure. Well, how did I specifically begin the Amen regimen? That's an interesting question. And it has multiple layers, I would say. So from an intellectual perspective, I've always been interested, and I should say from my adolescence, in science, in health, and my major in undergraduate school rather was in biology, and evolution specifically has always interested me. And I've always been interested in the manner in which organisms adapt to their environments in order to become more efficient and to increase their fitness so that they can propagate, proliferate. And I began to think about how organisms specifically acquire their sustenance from nature, and how their relationship with the environment sort of dictates what diet they use in order to acquire their nutrition. And I began to consider how human beings evolved and whether or not ascertaining what diet human beings evolved to exploit had on health and longevity. And I was a bit astounded by the lack of expert knowledge on the relationship between human evolution specifically and diet. And I found that it's not really an easy issue because human beings obviously are the most complex, cognitively speaking, organisms on the planet. And we've incurred a great deal of culturally driven evolution and adaptation. So what human beings actually eat and have eaten over the course of recorded history differs greatly from the diet to which we have evolutionarily been adapted to. So you have to consider approximately the last 10 million years of human and proto-human evolution in order to gain a sense of that. So I began to research this as an undergraduate. I became familiar with the large body of research surrounding caloric restriction, and I realized through my studies that the most reproducible, efficacious way of increasing maximum lifespan in diverse organisms is caloric restriction, whether that is quantitative caloric restriction or temporal caloric restriction. And so that was the impetus for my scientific research into the almond diet. Now, I initially intended to pursue this study in graduate school or in medical school, which I ended up attending. And my interest was purely academic, if you will. I wanted to amass all of the scientific evidence on the relationship between human evolution, longevity, and the diminution of disease, the reduction of disease. And I was just astounded by the information, not so much in the realm of anthropology, because that has always been very nebulous, but in the experimental evidence on caloric intake and longevity and optimal health, largely in animals. And this is an important distinction as well. Average human lifespan obviously differs widely throughout the globe and has differed widely throughout periods of human history. But when we speak of longevity, when we speak of aging, we're not talking about average lifespan, we're talking about maximum lifespan. That lifespan that organisms are biologically designed to attain if they avoid predation, infection, and all of the things that kill them prematurely in a state of nature. So in order to determine what is the maximum human lifespan, you really have to look at the oldest old, those human beings who have avoided premature death. And we know, based upon meticulous analyses, that that is exceeding 120 years. So a rough estimate is that human maximum lifespan is 1.25 centuries. Of course, we know that very few humans attain that age. And in modern Western countries, it's approximately 70 plus to 80 years. So I wanted to find out whether or not there was evidence that human beings, like animals, could attain a maximum lifespan exceeding that which we know is the biological limit. And the evidence, if we extrapolate from animal evidence, clearly indicates that that is a possibility. But to go back to your question of its origins, when I began to relate some of this information to my friends and to my then girlfriend, who would become my wife, she said, well, you're amassing all of this evidence. Why not apply it to ourselves? If it is likely that this applies to human beings as well, why don't we reap some of the benefits that we know are extant in animal experiments? And I could not come up with a valid reason against it. So almost immediately we began to practice that variant of the Amen protocol that we call the Omega Amen regimen. And that was approximately 16, 17 years ago today. And that Omega regimen initially entailed feeding every other day for a period of around 2 hours. So it was about a 46-hour fast, a 2-hour feeding period. And I felt great on that regimen. But we only sustained that regimen for approximately 3 to 6 months. And that was because I had begun very intensive training at the time, a combination of powerlifting and endurance training. And I found that the reduction in cell proliferation did not promote the recovery that I needed at that particular time. So over time, I adapted it to a single meal per day in the evening, a fasting period of 23 hours, and a feeding period of a single hour. And of course, the composition of the diet is thoroughly vegetal. It's primarily based on grains, beans, legumes, nuts, bread, sparse fruit and vegetation, but probably the most important dietetic component of the Amen regimen is what we call the Amen Amino Elixir. And it's a combination of several proteins, isolated amino acids, and multi-mineral, multivitamin supplement. And the import of that lies in the fact that when you restrict your caloric intake to the greatest extent practicable, you want to make sure that you're ingesting all of the requisite nutrients that you need for optimal health. So that's the first thing that we consume on an empty stomach on the Amen regimen.
I understand. I just want to point something. this information for our audience, for the people who will see this interview and will hear this information. The information about caloric restriction and longevity is an old information, is very well known. A lot of universities are competing into a contest where they try to keep lab mouse as much as they can alive to make their life as longer as possible. And this is one of their major tools. They restrict caloric intake for their lab animals, mouse or something else. And this is happening because the human body is not counting the time as a clock. The human body is like a machine. It's counting the miles that you are driving with that. It also, the human body, it's count the calories that it's happening to use, and more. And this is why we see even kids today look very different than our grandfather when they was kids. And we see this difference because today it's much easier to have a high amount of calories every day because you can eat 3 meals a day. And for us, for most of the people, they think it's the most optimal to have 3 meals a day. But most of the time in history, people didn't have 3 meals a day because didn't have microwave, didn't have refrigerator, didn't have all the tools that we have today to be able to eat 3-6 times a day. I don't know how people around the world are eating. And just want to be very clear, it's as you said, everything you decided to put in practice was because of the science. I want to ask you if in this period of time and or also today, do you know other people who are doing the same but for longer time than you?
No.
You didn't have opportunity to meet someone else who is practicing the same and it's older than you to have a change of information?
No. This practice was developed de novo, so to speak. So I experimented essentially upon myself. And as far as I know, there is no historical group, historical order that has had a lifelong practice of fasting essentially every single day. There are groups who abstain from eating solid food for a given day, but that's very different from the protocol that I prescribe, which entails avoiding ingesting any appreciable calories. So for instance, if you consume juice, if you consume sweetened beverages, that is anything but a fast because you are essentially ingesting food in the most assimilable form.
Yes.
So it's actually in many respects worse than feeding.
Yes, it's
Because
for someone who wants to get on caloric surplus, it's much easier to drink the food than to eat it normally because you take out the fiber, which is non-caloric, and you add more calories.
quite so.
I want to ask you if you can describe exactly one example of your meal, or if you have a photo of your meal that I can find on your Facebook. I'm very curious how big your meal is, because when I'm fasting and I'm recovering now after a surgery, but when I'm fasting, when I'm eating a lot. And I'm very curious to see how exactly one of your meal is looking.
That's a good question. The first part of the answer is that I would say that if you are concerned about scientifically ensuring that you are doing what is necessary to promote maximum lifespan extension, you really have two options. You can practice quantitative caloric restriction, and that will be independently conducive to longevity. Or you can practice cyclic fasting, that is fasting for protracted periods on a daily intermittent basis. Or, I should say 3, you can do both. I endeavor to do both. So my diet is both calorically restricted and temporally constricted, and it ranges between 1,500 and probably 1,750 calories. So a typical meal, the first thing would be the elixir that I described. And that's a combination of 3 proteins again. Isolated soy protein, brewer's yeast, spirulina, and about a dozen isolated amino acids, along with a little bit of fiber in the form of psyllium and pure cocoa powder, sweetened with a non-calorific sweetener, stevia, and containing, importantly, a supplement that delivers all of the essential micronutrients, that is, minerals and vitamins, in a powdered form. All of that is blended up. The approximate caloric content is around 250 calories, tops 300. Then immediately after that is the main meal, and that typically consists of beans and rice and a meat substitute such as tofu or another soy product added to it sparsely. After that is the minor meal, as we call it, what most people will call dessert. And that typically takes 2 forms. Usually it is what you could call a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. I'm somewhat reluctant to call it that because all it is crudely crushed peanuts and a preserved fruit, usually blueberry, or raw honey enriched with royal jelly on wheaten or oaten bread, or roasted peanuts in dark chocolate. That's another typical dessert. And that's pretty much it. There's some variations. For instance, tofu sandwiches, that's one of my main staples. Another staple is, say, pasta, which is less rarely consumed. But I don't really get much into the meal preparation because there's so much variety in terms of food. If you limit yourself to a plant-based diet, the variety is endless. And I find that because now a group of consistent practitioners of the Amen regimen is fairly, well, it's still small, let's say, but it's over 100 individuals, probably far more than that. But in our online group, say, there's more than 100 individuals, and all of these individuals, they have very interesting and unique diets. And as long as one follows the general framework of the Amen regimen, the 23-hour fast, the vegetal nutriture, the supplementation, the elixir. Of course, there's the exercise and the meditation component, but there are a lot of different variations, and some of them are quite skilled chefs, cooks, and that's an aspect of life that people enjoy, and it tends to be a part of their identity. So I like seeing the different varieties of food and food preparation rather, that are consistent with the regimen. I'm somewhat monotonous. I can have 3 varieties of bean, red, black, cannellini for a given week at a time, but one need not be limited to that. So for instance, in the volume where I discuss the Amen main meal, I talk about the scientific benefits of a bean-based diet and all of the molecular components like lectin and the effect that it has on alpha-glucosidase inhibitory activity. That's not a recipe book. It's telling you why the bean is selected as an ideal staple for consumption. Grains, I talk about the benefits of grains, how they encapsulate a great deal of stored energy that is ideal for a diet that is based on cyclic fasting. I talk about berries and the properties in berries that contribute to lifespan extension. The same with nuts. Multiple epidemiological studies on the benefits of nuts in general and peanuts more specifically. I talk about all of the spices that we use in the preparation of the meals and how they inhibit the process of glycation. So I don't really get into recipes, but I actually make an effort to elaborate the fundamental science that indicates why specific foods and food additives are conducive to lifespan extension, and I let other people actually run wild, if you will, on the variations of diet and vegetal literature. So that's my approach to it.
I can say I'm with you in idea of eating same thing for a long time. If I like something, like I really like kidney beans or black beans, I can eat the same thing again and again and again, and I feel every single time I enjoy as much as first time. I don't and for me, trying to find new recipe sometimes make me lose energy. And fasting for me, and I encourage a lot of people who tried a lot of diet, but they didn't have the time to cook 6 meals. A lot of nutritionists recommend you eat 6 small meals a day or do this stuff. You have to let your job to oh, it's getting harder and harder. Who is able to cook 6 times a day? Because I'm not. And sometimes for a lot of people who start to try intermittent fasting, because this is getting more and more popular, it's simple. And if you decide to eat healthy, eating once a day will be the easiest way to eat healthy, because it's easier to cook one meal than 6 or 5 and I totally understand you. I want to ask you also if you are drinking coffee or green tea or something that gives you some boost of energy.
Yes. So I consume approximately 2 liters of fluid a day, and that is primarily in the form of various teas: green tea, black tea, oolong tea. But mostly the teas that I drink are hibiscus tea, which tends to have blackberry leaves infused in it. Also ginseng tea, but a variety of teas. And I should say that, and also coffee. And all of these agents have particular compounds in them that effectuate one of those physiological effects that we know to modulate the aging process. So in terms of green tea, we know that it has properties that inhibit the process of glycation. We know that ginseng, for instance, and also turmeric, which I prepare a tea including turmeric, increase autophagy. We know that many of these compounds have antioxidant effects, anti-inflammatory effects. So all of them are included in the regimen imbibed during the fast because of these specific properties that they possess that are consistent with lifespan extension. But coffee is a particularly high on my list of what we might call Amen adjuvants. Coffee is independently associated with lifespan extension, both in empirical, experimental studies and epidemiological studies, and caffeine independent of coffee has been shown to exert anti-aging effects. And yes, the mild stimulant effect is also a good thing when you're fasting and when you have a particularly rigorous exercise regimen, such as the Amen protocol prescribes.
You are training a lot. I'm very curious to ask you, do you ever think about your results? Do you think you would be possible to have better results in your sport, in powerlifting, on a normal diet with a lot of dairies and meat? Or do you think you had these results because of the diet?
That's a good question. And I don't think that there is an easy answer to that question. I definitely think that if I had a normal diet, that is a diet containing, when I say normal, a conventional diet containing meat and caloric repletion, whether or not I would be as strong as I presently am or have been within the last decade, that's open to debate. There are great athletes who perform well on a conventional meat-based diet, but they definitely will not have a great longevity in the sport or in life. So you are definitely sacrificing a great deal if you have a conventional diet. I don't think there's any way that I would be at my present strength in my 5th decade of life if I had a conventional diet or even a regular vegetarian diet. I think that the Amen protocol specifically is responsible for the preservation of my strength and for my longevity in the sport. And I think also that it has given me some advantages, but I have to be clear, I put myself at a very great disadvantage in a sport that is predicated on power when I'm fasting for 23 hours a day. And in a competition, if it's an afternoon competition, I will have fasted for upwards of 16 hours, whereas an individual that I'm competing against will go in the morning, weigh in, and can eat throughout the day without any ramifications, if you will, in terms of classification. So if I'm weighing in at, say, 179 pounds, I might be competing against individuals in my weight class whose natural normal weight is upwards of almost 200 pounds. But they can diet down to make weight, and then they're in a fed state during competition. So lifting in a fasted state is challenging in and of itself, and then competing in a fasted state is even more challenging. So it's not an easy answer to say that the Amen protocol gives me a definite advantage in terms of competition. So I think that in actuality, there are some self-imposed limitations that the Amen regimen imposes for any strength athlete, but especially a competitive powerlifter.
I want to ask you, do you choose powerlifting because do you found it good and working well with your protocol? Because having small amount of reps, very anabolic training, not as catabolic as running a marathon or doing an Ironman, I was thinking you choose this sport because it's, in my opinion, it's working the best with your protocol and with your target in longevity.
In a sense, and I like your question as well. So in my conception, I've always wanted to engage in activities that I found to be ascetic. That is, that would enable me to exert control over my body. That is, my mind exerting control over my body and being able to compete with myself, essentially. So one of my goals in powerlifting is to be at the minimal requisite optimal weight while lifting in all of the 3 events the maximal amount of weight that I can. To be at the lowest healthy body weight and the highest possible strength is a valid definition of power, vigor, and health. And it's precisely what in powerlifting will get you acclaim, so to speak. So the ideal of powerlifting, in a limited sense, accords with the ideal that I envision in terms of my Amen protocol. To be as strong as I can possibly be is not absolute strength. So of course, I could be as big as I possibly could get and lift the maximal amount of weight that I could lift. but I would be damaging my health. So to be any extra weight that you have that composes your body frame is going to undermine your health. There is an optimal weight for every individual, and to exceed that is definitely going to put you at risk in terms of your longevity. So because in powerlifting you have categories, and you can lift purposely in a category that is consistent with your weight and lift the maximum amount of weight that you possibly can, it's inherently conducive to a regimen that is predicated upon a low body weight and maximal muscle strength. The other thing is that because it really does tax the mind, that is, you have to have maximal focus in order to exert your body to the greatest extent. It accords with my philosophical conception of transcending the physical limitations of the body to the greatest extent practicable. But I do combine powerlifting with persistence exercise, or what we might call aerobic exercise. And that's another thing that actually puts me at somewhat of a disadvantage relative to other competitive powerlifters. I don't know very many powerlifters that integrate aerobic training consistently into their regimen. So twice daily I'm engaging in aerobic exercise, and in the evening I'm doing resistance exercise. Twice weekly I'm doing specific power lifts. This is not a regimen that most competitive powerlifters would be able to sustain, but especially while maintaining a high level of performance in their sport. So it's a self-imposed limitation as well.
I just want to remind to people who will see this interview, Dr. Nun is holding the American record in deadlift. And seeing you deadlifting that weight, I'm deadlifting a lot. I like deadlift. It's one of my favorite exercise. I lift at 18 years old. When I was 18 years old, I did 210 kilo, and I was very proud for me, but I was more than 100 kilos weight. I was so fat that no one will say I'm an athlete, but I was eating like 3 times a day meat and rice and a lot of chocolate just to get big and move more weight. Seeing your lift was, you did it easy. I was always thinking, is that your personal best, that the lift from the contest, or you did in your own training more?
I've done in my own training a bit more, not appreciably more, but I have to say that I train harder at home than I do in competition. And it's always been a principle of mine that if I'm going to perform openly, I want to challenge myself personally in such a way that my performance seems easier. And so I've never really exerted myself to the full extent in any powerlifting competition. Perhaps that's just a personal preference, but that's just the way that I operate. I always challenge myself personally more than I expect to be challenged in the world, so to speak.
You want to look in front of the people like doing something like an art, in my opinion. You are doing something clean. You are not killing yourself for that move, that exercise. You are doing something beautiful. People are seeing how you lift, and they said, this man did a great performance. We see something incredible. Was a wonderful show. Not like other athletes who make the lift, but you can't even enjoy what they did, because you see the way they kill the sport in that moment, trying to beat their own record or lifting more kilos. I want to ask you, what do you think about CrossFit?
Uh, well, it's interesting that you mentioned CrossFit after that very insightful analysis. I like CrossFit. I don't personally do it. I like whenever individuals are finding something that they can consistently do to improve their physical health. What I don't like about CrossFit in many forms of exercise is overexertion. Um, I have to ask myself if what I am doing is contributing to my longevity or optimal health, or enables me to do something that I want to do. Um, if I'm a martial artist, I'm doing that because I personally like the art and the sport. If I'm not going to compete, if I'm not going to be a professional or even amateur fighter, I'm not going to risk head injury by overexerting myself and consistently taking blows to the head. I respect those who do, but I think that they're doing themselves a disservice. So in terms of CrossFit, if you are exerting yourself to the extent that you cannot adequately recuperate from a workout, and I see that often, then you're doing damage to your body, not a service to your body. So if it can be done in such a way that it is sustainable, then it's good. But I don't see that happening with most individuals who are engaged in CrossFit, and I just have to ask rhetorically, why? Why would you exert yourself to that extent, risk injury and sustain injury when it is not contributing to your long-term health or longevity?
Yeah, I'm also asking all the amateur athletes that I know, and I know a lot of athletes. Why are you taking steroids? Why are you risking yourself if you're not making millions of dollars from this? If you're making millions of dollars with this, I understand the compromise that you're doing for a period of time. But I see people risking their life a lot for nothing. They will be forever nobody. And I'm trying to stay healthy through my CrossFit. Now, because I'm recovering from a surgery that was not because of the CrossFit or something. I decided for the next year, when I will start train again, to do like small session of training under half an hour, because I never want to be in that over, I don't know how to explain, being so tired that I cannot wake up from the ground. I want to keep it good. I want to every session of training to have like 4 sessions of training under half an hour, to be a pleasure, to be able to finish the training without needing to stay half an hour down, trying to find where I am and how I can wake up again. Also, because I'm not making millions of euro from CrossFit, and if I want to teach other CrossFit, I have to be alive, and I have to be healthy. And I can still compete as an amateur. I can still promote the sport. But I also promote it with this idea. If it's helping you, I don't know, I was fat all of my life. I was obese. I was never thinking about me doing muscle up. After that, doing hand walk, doing some snatch, some Olympic lifting move, and after that running 2 miles. And for me it was challenging, and I feel as much as I'm doing it without doing like 3 hours of training in a row, without doing the training so long that I need 2 hours just to feel I can speak again, it's helping me. But when I did it at the start, when I did it so hard, I was feeling I'm not even doing major progress. and I decided I want to have an Olympic technique so good that to be a pleasure for others to see me working. I don't want to do a many reps, but I want to do it as good as possible, because for me it's more important to teach others than to do like a personal best or something.
Well said.
I also want to ask you about the food. We speak a lot about the food and the training. I want to ask you: do you grow your food? Do you buy the food? Are you preparing yourself? How you are you buying the food? Are you preparing by you? Are you growing in your own yard?
That's a good question. And it changes, and it has changed in the past. So I always intended the Amen diet specifically to be accessible to the poorest and most destitute people on the planet. So the food that is the staple of the Amen diet can all be acquired in the commonest grocery stores throughout the world. Dried rice, dried beans. I have in the past used a pressure cooker so that I could minimize cooking time and increase efficiency when I prepare large batches of beans. But with the busyness of my lifestyle presently, I'll sometimes get simply canned beans. So to answer your question very straightforwardly, I acquire my groceries from common grocery stores. I make a point to get organic food whenever it is economical. I don't spend exorbitant amounts of money to get organic food, although I can more easily afford it now. But that is my inclination, to get organic food as much as possible. We do grow some foods, but they tend to be seasonal. We live in the Northeast, Mid-Atlantic region of the U.S. I'm glad that we can grow figs here. That's probably my favorite fruit. So for a brief period, about a month or so, in late August, early September, I'll have figs. We grow blueberries in Maryland. I do have a property in Pennsylvania that I'm still renovating presently, and we'll grow quite a bit of produce there. I grow mint there, rhubarb. So we're going to incorporate more fresh vegetation sparingly into the diet. But for the most part, our foods are rather prepared, so to speak. But the bulk of it, grains, rice, bread, beans, tubers, very simple, very crude, that are accessible to most people. The only thing, but even the supplements, the micro supplements, the minerals and vitamins, that's something that is accessible throughout most of the world. So there is nothing really exotic about the Amen regimen, and it's designed that way for a purpose, and fortuitously, it's these very items that are most conducive to optimal health. You don't have to be wealthy in order to have the maximum longevity that science can possibly afford you. And I think that's a good thing.
I also want to say an information about the doctor that we have in Romania. We have in Romania a very old doctor. He's like a world-known doctor for neurological surgery. He's doing like brain surgery or something else, surgery on eyes, on the nerve of the eyes. Very, very he needs a very good skill. He's well known around the world, and he said is eating only once a day, because when he start to eat more than once a day, he cannot have the same concentration when he's working. He can have the same skill, and when he's surgery someone brain, and he's opening someone's head and working there. He said if he eats only twice a day, very small amount of food, he start to feel is not, the focus is not as good, the quality of his move, the sensitivity of his moves are not at top level. And he said he's eating a very small amount of food once a day, just to be sure all the blood is in the brain and in the muscle, not in the stomach, and the digestion to be as fast as possible, because he needs to read a lot, not only for skill to the surgery, but to learn more. He find more efficient to eat less and having a small amount of food. And it's a very, very good example, because not only if you want to be an athlete, but like also the sniper from the US, some of them are not eating in the daytime if they have a mission, because they are not able to shoot with the same precision if they are eating during the daytime, and they are eating only before sleep, when they can let the blood go to the stomach and have a good digestion during the night, and they wake up in the morning, the glycogen level is up, they are full of energy, they just drink a lot of water to have a good hydration, and they start the day. Also, I want to ask you if you think this diet is good for everyone, because the paleo diet is not a diet, is like a case subject, because the paleo diet is different everywhere in the world. The paleo man didn't have one diet. Some eat more fish because was to the sea, some eat more fruits because was in Africa, someone eats a lot of fat, a lot of meat because was in a cold area of the world. And do you think the DNA of the people, of all the people, it's perfectly working perfect with this diet? Or do you think this diet is working for some people, but you also find people who don't have the same results?
That's a good question. And the first thing I would do is dispute the notion that the paleo diet is multifarious. And the reason why is because human beings belong to a single species, and human beings diverged into races very recently in the past. That is, at a period that is after approximately 40,000 years ago. As a species, human beings have been in existence for nearly 250,000 years. Homo sapiens is nearly 250,000 years old, which means that we all descended from the same ancestors as a species that existed in the population pool around 250,000 years ago. As a genus, we are several million years old. As a clade of bipedal hominids, we are approximately, 10 million years old. The forms that we see, Sahelanthropus, Auroran, Ardipithecus, these are organisms that have been in a bipedal form, subsisting on generally similar foods for upwards of 10 million years. The agricultural revolution occurred approximately 10,000 years ago, and this is really when human beings started to develop divergent dietary habits. Has that had an influence on our biology and made us different? Certainly, but not so different as we might expect. So, and it's also important to realize that when we talk about extrapolating information from animals, the evidence is very clear. There are no substantial groups of organisms animals that have not benefited in terms of increased longevity from caloric restriction, cyclic fasting, even starvation if we're talking about single-celled organisms. So the notion that the Amen regimen is not optimal for different groups of humans normal humans is not tenable. All the evidence indicates that the only consistent way to increase maximum longevity in a human species, or rather in humans, in multifarious species, is some form of quantitative or temporal caloric restriction. And of course, humans have to consider specifics about the diet that we've been adapted to consume, and that is vegetal. Meat has only been in the human diet for maximum 20,000 years. That period of time that we start to see sophisticated lithic projectile weapons, as I discussed in my first book, Evolutionary Nutrition. And it was only sporadically adopted by human groups. There are groups in Southeast Asia and Africa that never had an extensive period of meat consumption. And we have to be clear, humans are basically Africoid. We originated in Africa, we persisted in Africa for hundreds of thousands of years before we left the continent, and only diverged racially at around 40,000 years ago.
Yes, I also have this recommendation when I'm recommending people to eat less meat, less dairies, less eggs. Some people are saying, but we are different. We are not, it's not fine to recommend the same diet to everyone. And I'm saying, as much as we have the same stomach, the same intestines, the same anatomy, when you are going to someone to doing a surgery on you, the doctor is not saying, I need a doctor for Asian, because their anatomy is different. No, everyone's anatomy is the same. And this idea of we are from this country, we are adapt, no, it's wrong. Our anatomy is herbivore. We are not tolerating meat, there is an eggs. And if we are doing it, we are doing with risk of disease. The inflammation that we get, the side effects that we get from eating foods that we are not designed to eat are clear, and we see. After having a life expectancy growing in, I don't know, in last 200 years, we start to see now a decrease in longevity of people around the world, because the meat, we all have access to meat now, we all have access to high dense caloric food. We can eat now the amount of calories that just our parents eat in one day. We can eat now in one fast food meal, and we will start to see a decrease of aging, of longevity, and we see a clear increase of heart disease, which is only food related, of diabetes type 2, which is only food related, and a lot of disease that we can live longer. And some people are asking me, do you want to live 200 years, 100 years? And all I want to say to people, I want a quality life. I don't want to, my grandfather is having now, my grandmother is having now heart disease, diabetes, and he is having cancer. He was just had a surgery. My grandfather died by cancer. I don't want with my kids to let them have this memories with me in hospital, full of medication, feeling weak. I want to have the same memories that I have with my grandmother, who had a long life. He died at home. After, we just see in every morning she was full of energy. In every afternoon she had a very, very less energy, and she was very weak day by day until his life end. What was so beautiful, and we had these very beautiful memories, even with the way she died. And this is motivates me more than living 10 times more than everyone else, and being alone in this world, the quality of my life, and this is for me very important.
Well said. Well said.
In the end, also I want to ask you if spirituality has a place in your regimen, because the food has a place, the way you eat, the way you drink, the way you I think sometimes the way you travel, the way you spend your time, everything is influenced by this idea of having a longer life and a good quality life. Spirituality is having a place in your life?
Definitely so, but with some qualifications. I do not believe in a personal deity that is distinct from myself. I do not believe in anything that transcends the known laws of physics as I understand them. I do believe that there is an aspect of existence that is far deeper than what we typically perceive when we are using our ordinary insights. When I meditate, I believe that I tap into the very essence of existence that is at the core of my being and that links me to the larger universe. And that fills me with a sense of awe and a sense of self-reverence and reverence for nature. But that is the extent of my personal conception of a deity, if you want to use that term. My life is very ritualistic, and that is, everything has an order. I fast for a specific period of time. I eat at a specific period of time. I exercise at a specific time. I meditate at a specific time, and I even read my liturgy at a specific time, and that liturgy is of a spiritual nature, spiritual by which I mean ascetic. So for instance, Jainism, yoga, Samkhya, all of these Eastern philosophies, Egyptian philosophy, it is something that relates my mind to self-transcendence, the transcendence of the individual self. This is what has religious significance to me. So in that sense, I would call myself a religious atheist.
I understand. I ask you this at the end of the interview because I find a lot of studies that shows people who believe in some, or they have, or people who has a spiritual life live longer, have a healthier mind, and I believe is helping a lot to have a good mood in your mind, and spirituality and believing in something, I don't know, for every people is different and makes sense from people to people. I think it helps if you do everything in the right way. Also this, it's increasing and is helping to keep a balance in your life. And I understand it's very interesting your the way you believe and the way you meditate. Also for me, I find it's very, very hard to meditate because I'm such a realistic, scientific kind of person, and I find very hard to stay that time and having an empty mind when I can just take a book and read more and more and more, and doing this every single time, opening the phone, opening metadata or some national scientific sites and reading again and again. But I find that from a point I became so tired and I just need to chill. And I find on the internet, if you know, it's a man who is learning people at TV how to meditate. Is a man who is very well known because he's going like in ice water and swimming in ice water. I don't know if you found that guy on the internet.
I think you might be referring to a Hoff.
I think it's the same, the guy who show people how to Respire and the TV show, and also he have a very viral clip about living without disease or something like this. And I find very interesting the way he recommends meditation, so practical, step by step. I think for me is the only way I can try it because my mind is so focused or on something scientifically clear that is hard for me to have a moment of silence.
Yes, that's understandable. But I think that one of the definite benefits of meditation and any ascetic practice is that it is a challenge. And if something is not a challenge, it's probably not worth that much. So it definitely takes a great deal of self-control and self-discipline to sit still, to suppress your breathing, and to banish thought from the mind, because it's very natural for your thoughts to wander, to effervesce. And it is the most immediate thing you can do to exert control over yourself, to be able to exert control over your own ideas. And the stepwise approach has its merits, but unless you are engaged in the active attempt to be still, to not think, to not feel, it is something short of meditation. So true meditation, I would submit, is the act of entering and penetrating as deeply as you can into the recesses of your mind. And in the recesses of your mind, there is no thought, there is no sensation, there is no conceptualization. And we can only approximate this through meditation. The only true attainable vapidity or void, if you will, is death. Of course, anything short of death is not entering fully into the void. So meditation is only an approximation of that state when we assume when all of our physiological cerebration comes to an end. But it's a way of gradually approaching the state of death and maintaining tranquility and serenity at the same time.
I understand, Doctor. I thank you a lot for this opportunity to interview you. I think you are a very great example. I think the research that you did, the motivation to put everything in practice, it's incredible. It's I have no words to say how much I appreciate what you're doing, and I have no words to say how motivated I am from the first moment I found you to every single day. When I'm training, most of the time, when I'm doing deadlift or when I'm doing some kind of powerlifting move, I'm just remind you in my head, and I'm saying I have to fast better, I have to eat better, because seeing a person so motivated as you are is make me feel like I have no excuse. And if you had all the information and you failed, I feel like I have an excuse. But seeing you so motivated, so full of science and everything in one package, make me feel I have no excuse. I have to do it. And for this, I want to thank you, and I want to say you influenced my life and the life of others people. And I will share your example and share your information and who you are with as many people as I can, because I think a lot of life will be changed, and not you will live more, but because of you, others will live more, and life of others will be increased. And I just want to say thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. That recognition, and it's always gratifying to know that I can be a source of motivation and inspiration, especially for an individual like yourself. You have a very good heart. I can tell that. You have a great deal of social interest. I like your discipline. I like your focus. And just continue to do what you're doing.
Thank you a lot. Thank you for your time.
It's been a pleasure.